The last table went down at 11:47 in the morning. Dean Marlow straightened up slowly, pressing one hand against the small of his back, and looked at the walnut surface the way a man looks at work he won't be paid enough for. The grain was clean. The joints were tight. Someone else had scratched the finish on the corner, probably during loading, and he had spent 20 minutes in the parking lot, with a cloth and a tin of wax, before letting it go through the door. Toby had watched from the truck, one boot resting on the running board. "You know they're just going to put a tablecloth on it," he said. Dean picked up his canvas bag. "And when the cloth comes off, the table will look right." That's not a financial argument. No, it's the other kind. They had been at the Portland Convention Center since 8 in the morning, moving 6 pieces of restored furniture for a corporate event that would fill the hall by evening. The pay was fair. The load was heavy. Dean's left shoulder had been bothering him since October, the kind of low-grade ache that a man in his mid-40s either treated or learned to ignore. Dean had done neither. He had driven 40 minutes with it, carried walnut across marble floors with it, and planned to drive home with it and call it a day. Toby was tying down the last of the moving straps when Dean heard it. "Wait!" One word. A woman's voice. Young, precise, the kind of voice that had been trained early not to waver. Dean turned. 3 young women stood less than 3 steps behind him. He noticed the wrongness of it first. Not wrong in any threatening way, but wrong in the way that something impossible is always slightly wrong when it first appears. They were clearly not identical in the way of a single face repeated. Each of them had some small difference in the set of her jaw, the angle of her shoulders, but the eyes were the same in all 3, gray still, measuring, the hair the same, black, cut close to the jaw, no part, no decoration, and the faces carried the same quality of composure that isn't natural to any person, but can be learned young if someone insists on it. The one in the center was looking at his arm, not his face, not the table. His left forearm, where his flannel sleeve had rolled up to the elbow during the move. Dean looked down at the tattoo out of reflex, the way a man checks his collar when someone stares at his neck. He had nearly forgotten it was there. The compass was old ink, the lines softened by years into something that looked almost like a charcoal sketch instead of a proper tattoo. The North Star was missing from the upper quadrant. It had been missing from the drawing the night he drew it, and it had been missing ever since. The young woman in the center spoke quietly. "My mother has that tattoo." Dean was certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry?" The one on the left stepped forward half a pace, on her left shoulder. "The brake is in the same place." There was a sound from the truck. Toby had turned around. Dean stood very still. He had a working knowledge of how long 21 years was. He had spent 21 years getting up before Toby needed to be at school, eating whatever was cheapest while making sure Toby ate what was best, rebuilding his workshop twice when the margins ran too thin, and never asking anyone for a thing he could manage to go without. In 21 years, he had not met a single person who shared that tattoo. He knew it was not possible for someone to share it without knowing him. The compass existed nowhere in any flashbook or design catalog. He had drawn it himself on a folded cocktail napkin in a bar on Capitol Hill in Seattle, on a night when the rain had been coming in sideways, and a woman named Sarah had sat down beside him and asked him what he was drawing. He had said, "A compass." She had looked at the missing star and said, "A compass without a North Star is at least honest." She had laughed at that, and Dean, who was 24 and exhausted and had a 13-month-old son asleep in the care of a neighbor, had laughed too, and they had talked for 3 hours, and 2 days later they had gone together to a parlor on Pine Street and had the same drawing put on their skin. The same broken compass, the same absent star. 3 days after that she was gone. No phone number, no address, not a note on the table, not a message left with the bartender, not a text from a number he could call back. Gone in the way that some people are simply gone, as though they had decided the particular story they had been part of was finished and had quietly closed the cover. Dean had not looked for her. He had had Toby. He had had rent. He looked at the 3 young women now, He calculated their ages without meaning to. He looked at the particular gray of their eyes. He looked at the way the one in the center tilted her head very slightly to the right when she was waiting for something. Sarah had done that. He remembered it with absolute certainty, because he had seen her do it exactly once, on the second night, across a small table in a restaurant he could no longer name, and it had stayed with him because it was the kind of gesture that a person only makes when they are genuinely uncertain and have decided to wait instead of push. His throat had gone completely dry. "What's your mother's name?" he asked. The woman in the center started to answer. A man in a black suit appeared from somewhere to Dean's left, moving the way that people who are paid to manage situations move. Quickly, without seeming hurried, already in the process of redirecting before anyone had finished speaking. "Ladies," the man said. His voice was low and flat. "The car is waiting." He used a name, the Hastings girls. The three women were walked away with a smoothness that suggested this happened regularly. One of them, the one on the left, who had measured the tattoo most carefully, looked back at Dean as she was guided toward the exit. Her expression was not frightened. It was not contemptuous. It was full of a very specific kind of question, the kind that has been sitting unanswered for a long time and has learned to look patient. Toby appeared at Dean's elbow. "Dad." Dean did not answer. He watched the black SUV pull away from the curb and disappear into the late morning traffic, carrying three young women with his tattoo on their mother's shoulder, and he stood on the sidewalk for what felt like a very long time, but was probably less than a minute. That evening, in the apartment above the dry cleaner on Burnside, Dean opened his laptop at the kitchen table. The lamp was on. The heat was working. He could hear Toby in the next room, the low sound of a design program running. He typed 2 words, Sloane Hastings. The results came in before he had fully pressed the key. They always did for names like that. She had a Wikipedia entry, a company page, a Forbes profile, a profile in the Times from 2 years ago. The photographs were recent. The biography was substantial. Sloane Hastings, 43 years old, founder and CEO of Hastings Global, a logistics automation company headquartered in Portland that had grown in 12 years from a regional freight operation to one of the most consistently profitable firms in its sector. Single mother, 3 daughters, triplets born 20 years ago. The identity of the father had never been disclosed. He clicked on the company profile photograph. The hair was different. Shorter, darker now, worn back. The clothes were the kind that cost more than his truck. The expression was different too, flattened and controlled, in the way that high-stakes public life teaches people to hold their faces. But it was Sarah. He did not need the jaw or the eyes or any particular feature to confirm it. He simply knew, the way a person knows a song from 3 notes, even when the arrangement has changed completely. Toby came to stand behind him. He read what was on the screen without being asked to. He was quiet for a moment. "You think they're yours?" he said. Dean looked at the screen for a long time. "I think someone owes me an answer." He closed the laptop. He did not sleep well. He lay in the dark, and he did not make a list of what he wanted or what he planned to demand, because both of those things required a kind of clarity he did not have. What he had instead was a simple understanding, the kind that comes not from reasoning but from arithmetic. 20 years was a number. 3 daughters was a number. 24 hours he had spent drawing a compass on a cocktail napkin with a woman named Sarah was a number. The math was not complicated. In the morning, he showered and changed into the cleanest shirt he owned, which was canvas button-down, and put on his work boots because he had no other shoes, and he drove downtown. The lobby of Hastings Global was white marble and black steel and cool recycled air. It smelled like a building that cleaned itself. Dean's boots left small dusty marks on the floor as he walked to the reception desk, and he saw the receptionist's eyes move to the boots and back up again in the efficient way of someone who has been trained to assess without appearing to. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." He took a notepad from the desk, wrote 4 words, and slid it across the counter. "I have the compass." The receptionist read it. Her expression did not change. She picked up her desk phone. There was a brief conversation Dean could not hear. She set the phone down, and her tone, when she spoke again, had changed in a way he recognized as the kind of change that happens when a name means something to the person on the other end of the line. 72nd floor, she said. Someone will meet you. The elevator was private. It opened directly into a short hallway. A woman he didn't recognize, one of the administrative staff, led him to a door and knocked once and opened it. The office was floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. Portland lay in every direction below it, small and arranged and distant. Sloane Hastings was standing at the far window, with her back to the door. She turned when she heard him come in. He watched her face go through 3 things in less than a second: recognition, calculation, and then the particular stillness that comes after a person decides not to show either of the first 2 things anymore. "Dean," she said. He looked at her. He thought about what he had prepared to say. He had rehearsed several versions in the truck. All of them seemed too large for the room now, too loaded, too much like accusations when what he actually wanted was an answer. "What did you keep from me?" he said. The conversation that followed was cold at the start, and then became something more difficult than cold. She asked him what he wanted. He told her the truth. She asked him how much money it would take for this not to go further. He told her that he had not known she existed as anything other than Sarah until 48 hours ago. Which meant the money had nothing to do with it, which meant the question was the wrong question. She said she had reasons. She spoke about what it meant to raise 3 daughters in a world that scrutinized every element of their existence. She spoke about the pressure of a public family, the violence of tabloid attention, the specific cruelty of wealthy men who used children as legal instruments. She was not wrong about any of it. She was simply applying it to the wrong argument, he said. Danger is not a reason to hide a father from his children for 20 years. That landed somewhere. He could see it. After a long time, she confirmed what he already knew. Ruby, Hazel, Piper. She said the names evenly, one after the other, as though she had rehearsed this too, but found that no rehearsal was adequate. He asked her to say them again, because he wanted to hear them without preparing for them. She did. He sat down. He did not sit down to be dramatic. His legs simply made the decision before he did. He asked if he could meet them once. One meeting, on neutral ground, with no lawyers present, with no press involved, with no agenda other than standing in the same room as them, with the full truth already spoken. He said he would not file anything, would not call anyone, would not show up at the building again. He needed 1 hour. She told him no. She told him they didn't need more disruption. He stood up. "You let them live with half the truth," he said. "Don't call the rest of it disruption." He left. She remained standing in the center of the glass office, and, for the first time in 20 years, the thing she had kept contained was no longer entirely in her control. 3 days later, she came to the workshop. She did not come alone. The man in the black suit, Marcus Vale, stood outside the door, and a woman named Evelyn Price, who had the efficient bearing of someone whose entire professional life consisted of solving problems before they became scandals, came in with a leather folio and set it on Dean's workbench. The workshop was small and low-ceilinged. It smelled of sawdust and linseed oil and the particular warmth of wood that has been worked and reworked. On the walls were Toby's design drawings, pinned at angles that were more practical than decorative. There was a debt repayment calendar. There were invoices from the lumber yard. There was a photograph of Toby at about 8 years old, holding a finished birdhouse, squinting into the camera. Sloane looked at all of it without commenting. Evelyn opened the folio and set down a sealed envelope. Inside, as Evelyn explained, was a non-disclosure agreement and a check for $2 million. The terms were clear. Dean would have no contact with Ruby, Hazel, or Piper Hastings. He would make no public statement about any biological connection. He would not pursue legal action. He would not approach Sloane. He would, in exchange for permanent silence, receive enough money to resolve every financial problem he currently had, and several he had not yet thought of. Dean looked at the envelope. He did not pretend it had no weight. $2 million was not an abstraction for a man who had spent 17 years calculating whether he could afford both the lumber and the gas in the same week. It was the workshop saved, it was the debt erased, it was Toby's tuition paid through the end of his program, with money left over. It was every 3 in the morning arithmetic session he had ever sat through, resolved in a single document. He put his hand on the envelope. He could feel the thickness of the paper through it. He pulled his hand back. "You're buying my absence," he said. She said she was protecting her daughters. He said no. "You're protecting the story you told them." They argued then, with the controlled precision of two people who were too tired for volume. She said she had given the 3 girls everything they needed. The schools, the travel, the security, the exposure to the world in a form that would serve them for the rest of their lives. He did not dispute any of it. He said that none of it answered the simplest question any child could ask, which was not whether her father was rich, or whether he was powerful, but whether he had left by choice. She asked what he wanted, if not the money. He told her, 1 hour, a neutral location. She would bring them, she would use his name. After that, if they wanted tests, lawyers, schedules, attorneys present, he would agree to any structure they needed. She picked up the folio and left the envelope on the bench. He stood and looked at it for a long time after the door closed. Toby had been in the back room. He came out slowly. "You sure?" he said. Dean picked up the envelope, held it for a moment, and put it in the trash can beside the lathe. "No," he said, "but if I sell this, I won't be able to look at you the same way." Toby was quiet for a moment. "I was going to say something profound," he said, "but I'm just watching $2 million sit in our trash can." Dean looked at the can. "Yeah," he said, "that part hurts too." Ruby found the name of the workshop within a week. She had a gift for research, the systematic kind, and she had Hazel's ability to cross-reference secondary sources, which meant that between the two of them, the trail from the convention center delivery receipt to the workshop address on Southeast Morrison took less time than Sloane had assumed it would. Piper had already enlarged one of the old photographs from a charity profile Sloane had done 8 years earlier, the kind of event where the dress was sleeveless and the tattoo was visible on the left shoulder if you knew to look. The 3 of them had grown up in a house where information was power. They had learned this from Sloane, and from Victor before her, and from a childhood in which discretion was a daily discipline. What they had not expected was to one day direct that skill at their own family. At dinner one evening, Hazel set down her fork. "Who is Dean Marlow?" Sloane held very still for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Ruby put down her knife. "You know him," she said. It was not a question. Piper said, "Is he connected to us?" The silence that followed was the most informative thing Sloane had said in years. Hazel asked for a DNA test. Sloane said that families were not laboratories. Hazel said that if the truth were already present, the test would only confirm it, and confirmation was not the same as accusation. Ruby looked at her mother with the gray eyes that had always seemed to hold more information than they let out. "You didn't fail to find him," Ruby said. "You chose not to, didn't you?" Victor Hastings learned about it through Marcus, who had been keeping him informed out of professional obligation and personal anxiety. Victor processed the information the way he had processed every threat to the family's position in his 67 years. As a structural problem requiring a structural solution. He did not think about feelings. He thought about exposure. He thought about optics. He thought about the trust documents, the estate provisions, the company governance structure that had been built carefully over decades. And he thought about what happened to carefully built structures when an unknown variable appeared in the foundation. He arranged a meeting at the family home with Sloane and Evelyn. He said he needed this resolved. He said the word resolved with the precision of someone for whom it had always meant eliminated. He wanted Dean Marlow to sign a document and disappear, the same way problems had always been made to disappear when enough money and enough lawyers were applied in the right sequence. Sloane listened. She had listened to Victor her entire life. He had taught her how to hold a room, how to read a balance sheet, how to insulate herself from people who wanted things from her. He had taught her that vulnerability was a liability, and that family was a controlled environment, not an open one. She told him she would handle it. Piper sent an email from a new account. She wrote it carefully, the way she did most things. Slowly, precisely, with attention to the physical weight of each word. She said, "If you truly didn't take the money, we would like to meet you." Dean read it at midnight in the workshop. He had been finishing a repair on a dining chair that needed to be delivered by Thursday. He read the email twice. He called Toby. "You want to come with me for this?" Toby answered without hesitating. "I don't think you should do this one alone," Dean wrote back. He had one condition: no press. No money discussed. No lawyers arranged in a line between them and him like a wall. He wanted Sloane present, not because he needed her permission, but because he did not want the three of them to hear the truth for the first time without their mother in the room. Sloane chose the Botanical Conservatory on the north side of the city. She had thought about it for 2 days before deciding. Not her house, because that was her territory, and she did not want him standing in her kitchen unable to move comfortably. Not his workshop, because that was his territory, and she would not be able to control the conversation. Not a restaurant, which would be too public. Not a conference room, which would feel like a deposition. The conservatory was open and botanical and had enough ambient sound to prevent anyone from being cornered. It was as close to neutral ground as Portland offered. Dean arrived 20 minutes early with Toby. He had scrubbed his hands twice, which was about as ceremonial as he got. He was wearing a flannel he'd ironed, which Toby had noted without commenting. "Just breathe," Toby said. "I am breathing." Not particularly convincingly. Dean almost smiled. Sloane walked in at the exact scheduled time. Behind her, spaced at even intervals that suggested they had agreed on no particular formation, came Ruby, Hazel, and Piper. They stopped a few feet away. All three of them looked at him differently. Ruby was measuring. Hazel was cataloging. Piper was doing something quieter and harder to name, looking at him the way she might look at a piece of furniture that had been stored wrong for years, assessing the damage, trying to understand what the original form had been. Sloane said his name and Toby's name, in that order, and left off every other word that might have explained the situation, because the situation was already understood by everyone in the room, and saying it aloud would have made it smaller somehow. Ruby spoke first. "You didn't take the money." Dean looked at Sloane for one moment. Then he looked at Ruby. "No, why not?" "Because the first thing you'd ever know about me would have been a lie." "I didn't want to start there." Hazel asked about legal action. He said no. Piper asked about the compass. He reached into his shirt pocket and brought out a folded photocopy of a page from a notebook, the original drawing on a cocktail napkin, reproduced years ago onto proper paper so it wouldn't dissolve. The line was unsteady. The compass was broken. The North Star was absent. He had also brought 3 small pieces of cherry wood. He had made them the previous evening after getting Piper's email, sitting in the workshop in the dark with the hand tools, because the machines would have been too loud at that hour, and the neighbors had a sleeping infant. Each piece was roughly the size of a playing card. Into each one he had carved a compass, complete this time, all 4 cardinal points, the North Star present and properly placed. He set them on the stone edge of the nearest planter. "I didn't know what to bring," he said. "I make furniture, so I made these." Piper picked up the nearest one before anyone else moved. She held it close to her face. "It smells like smoke," she said. "Cherry wood usually does." Toby, whose particular gift was knowing when silence had lasted long enough, said, "He also smells like wood glue. You'll get used to it." The air moved slightly. Something shifted. Ruby was still careful. Hazel still wanted the test. Piper held the carved compass in both hands and looked at it with an expression that Dean recognized from Toby at the age of 8, the expression of a child who has just been given something that answers a question they had been too young to know they were asking. Sloane stood back. She did not enter the conversation. She watched her daughters navigate it, and she did not try to direct them. which was the first genuinely uncontrolled thing she had done in a very long time. At the end, Ruby said, "I don't know what to call you," Dean said. "Dean is fine. We don't have to skip ahead." She did not argue with that. The door was open, even if only barely. Victor escalated within the week. A piece appeared on a finance blog, unsigned, sourced with enough vague specificity to seem credible, that described an unknown craftsman who had approached the Hastings family shortly after the three daughters had come of legal age and taken partial control of their trust assets. The piece did not accuse anyone directly. It mentioned unpaid business debts, a modest income, a prior failed relationship. It used the word opportunist once, in a subordinate clause, at a distance from any specific name, which was the careful way of saying the thing, without being held responsible for saying it. Victor followed this with a formal legal request, submitted through Evelyn's firm, to restrict Dean's access to the Hastings daughters on the grounds that his presence created potential psychological pressure and reputational risk. Dean read the document in the workshop. Toby read it over his shoulder. He had expected money. He had expected lawyers. He had not entirely expected to be converted, in a legal document, from a father who had just learned the truth into a threat who needed to be contained. He said nothing about the blog post. The blog post could be ignored. The legal filing was a different instrument. It was not designed to silence him. It was designed to make the three young women afraid of him, to preemptively contaminate what he was before they had time to decide for themselves. Piper went to the workshop on a Tuesday afternoon with Toby, who had started texting her after the conservatory meeting with the casual regularity of a person who has decided another person is interesting and has not yet complicated it with strategy. She walked through the space and she looked at it the way she had learned to look at spaces in her design program. Not at the finished surfaces, but at the underlying structure, the evidence of decisions made and decisions avoided. She saw the clamping system on the east wall, each clamp hanging in its designated spot, labeled in pencil. She saw the stacked reference drawings in the flat file, arranged chronologically. She saw the repair log hanging on a nail near the door, a paper ledger going back 11 years, every piece of furniture that had come through the shop, recorded by date and condition on entry and exit. This was not the workspace of someone who had recently decided to cultivate proximity to a wealthy family. This was the workspace of someone who had been doing the same careful, underpaid work for a very long time, because it was the work he was capable of doing well. She told Sloane, "If you let grandfather write this story for us, we won't trust any story you tell us after." Ruby read the legal filing and went still with a cold anger that was different from her usual guardedness. Ruby's anger was rare but directional. She aimed it at the document and at the signature on the cover letter. Hazel traced the blog post to its IP origin in 3 hours, using tools she had learned in a security elective her sophomore year, and she found what she expected to find. Nothing conclusive, but a pattern of access that suggested the source was internal to a system she recognized. Sloane called a meeting with Evelyn and with Victor. She did not raise her voice. She did not arrive in anger, because anger in that family had always been a currency spent by the person who could afford to lose the most, and she had spent it badly before. She arrived with a folder of documents, with a prepared statement, and with the specific kind of composure that comes not from distance, but from having finally decided what the correct answer is. She withdrew the legal filing. She withdrew it entirely, and she sent written notice to Dean's address through a messenger, not Evelyn's firm, which was her way of making clear this was a personal action and not a legal one. She then contacted the administrator of the family's estate records and spent 4 hours correcting the documentation that described her daughter's parentage. No press conference, no statement, no public gesture, only the forms. Dean Marlow, woodworker, listed as the biological father of Ruby Ann Hastings, Hazel Joan Hastings, and Piper May Hastings, in every legal document that required it. When Victor told her she was opening the door to a man who did not belong in their world, she said, "He doesn't need to belong to our world to be their father." She said it without anger and without drama, which was the only way she knew how to say, a thing that had taken her 20 years to arrive at. It was the first time she had used her authority to protect the truth rather than to manage it. The dinner happened 3 weeks later. Sloane arranged it in the glass room at the back of the main house. A smaller structure than the formal dining room, its roof entirely transparent, surrounded by container gardens that Piper had been slowly redesigning over the past 2 years. She did not tell Dean it was the informal room. She told him only the time and the address, and she left the rest to him. He almost did not come. He sat in the truck for 7 minutes in the drive before Toby said, "If you actually want to be a father, sometimes you have to sit at a table that feels like someone else's." Dean got out of the truck. The table was already set when they arrived. 6 places, no staff. Sloane had cooked, which was not something she did often, and the food was plain in a way that suggested she had deliberately not attempted anything she might be impressive at. Ruby opened the conversation about Seattle. She wanted to know what he remembered. He told her, the rain, the bar on Capitol Hill, the cocktail napkin, the drawing. He told her he had been 24 and had a son 13 months old and had been working 2 jobs. He told her Sarah had laughed at the broken compass, and that he had not understood until much later why that particular laugh had stayed with him. Hazel asked about the workshop's finances. Not to judge, she explained, but because she had read the blog post and wanted to understand the actual numbers. He walked her through them. The debt from the equipment lease, the slow months in summer when residential commissions dried up, the 1 year he had taken contract work, refinishing hotel furniture just to keep the power on. He did not clean it up or minimize it. He said it the way it was. Piper asked who had taught him to work wood. He said, a man named Gerald Forsyth, who had run a repair shop in Tacoma, and had let a 19-year-old work Saturdays, for no pay, because he could see the kid needed something to do with his hands. Gerald had died of a stroke in 2011, and Dean had driven 8 hours each way to be at the burial, because there was no one else who had taught him what careful work looked like from the inside. Toby talked about the winters. He did not perform them or dramatize them. He described them the way someone describes weather they have lived in. The meals of eggs and pasta, the neighbors whose chairs Dean repaired for nothing, because they were old, and the chairs were the good kind of old. The year the truck broke down in January, and they rode the bus for 3 months, and Dean had treated it as a logistical problem rather than a disaster. Sloane listened to all of it. She had her hands around a glass of water. She did not interrupt, and she did not explain, and she did not offer anything to soften or contextualize what she was hearing, because this was not a time for management. This was a time for the particular discipline of staying in a room while the facts of another person's life are laid down plainly in front of you. At the end of the dinner, Ruby asked the question she had been carrying since the conservatory. If you had known about us from the beginning, would you have stayed? Dean looked at her for a long time. He said, I don't know if I would have been good enough at 24. I was already trying to figure out how to be a father to Toby, and I was failing at it regularly. But I can tell you what I did with the son I knew about. I stayed. I didn't stay because it was easy. I stayed because leaving would have been a different kind of man than the one I wanted to be. He paused. I think I would have tried to be that for you too. It was not a perfect answer. It was the true one. Hazel said. The DNA results were back. She had requested the test herself, through a private lab, using a cheek swab she had collected from Dean at the conservatory. She had asked him directly for it, before the meeting ended, and he had said yes without hesitating, which she had noted as the most relevant piece of information he had provided. She put the document on the table. Dean was their biological father, 99.98% probability. Across all 3, nobody was surprised. The truth being confirmed in writing was different from the truth being suspected, though. Something in the room changed its weight. Sloane said finally the thing she had been composing and discarding for weeks. I should have looked for you. I had the resources. I had the means. I made a choice not to. Not because it was impossible, because I was afraid. Ruby looked at her. Afraid of him, or afraid of us knowing you'd made the decision for us? Sloane did not answer immediately. It was the first time in her daughter's adult memory that she had sat in a room with a question she could not answer on the first pass. Hazel's eyes were bright. She was not crying loudly. She was simply in the state, just before tears, of a person who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time, and has just let it come close. Piper reached into the pocket of her jacket and set something on the table beside the DNA report. It was a small piece of cherry wood, carved roughly, by someone who was new to carving. The compass on it was uneven. The North Star was present but lopsided. She had made it herself in the workshop on a Tuesday afternoon, while Toby talked about his thesis project, and Dean worked on a drawer assembly nearby without asking what she was doing. Dean looked at it and did not move toward the three of them. He stayed where he was. He let the distance be theirs to decide. That was the decision that cracked the first wall. Not an embrace, not a declaration. Just a man who understood without being told that a family that has been reorganized by 20 years of omission cannot be rushed into closeness by anyone's need for resolution. It would take time. It had already taken time. 3 months after the dinner, the workshop on Southeast Morrison had a regular Tuesday presence. Hazel came with a legal pad and spent 2 visits reorganizing the accounting system into something that would survive an audit, which it had not been capable of before. She did it without commentary, without suggestion that he should have done it sooner, with the focused efficiency of a person applying a skill to a problem, because the problem is there, and the skill is available. When she was done, she left the ledger open to the new system and said, "There's a tax filing from 3 years ago that has an error. I'll send you the corrected form." She was already halfway to the door. Ruby sent texts. Short ones, once or twice a week. The kind of message that looks like nothing, but is actually the specific maintenance behavior of someone who is deciding to keep a channel open. She asked once about the grain pattern on quarter-sawn oak, and why it looked different from flat-sawn, which Dean recognized as a question whose answer she had already researched, and wanted to see whether he would give her the same one. He did. She sent back a single word, "Okay." Piper came most often. She brought a design problem 1 week. A corner in a client's house where the built-in shelving wasn't working, and she couldn't locate the problem, and she and Dean spent an hour with a tape measure and a sketchbook before she saw it. The blocking was wrong on the left side, throwing the visual weight off by 2 inches. She fixed it. The following week she came back without a specific problem, and Toby put on music, and she learned the difference between cherry and walnut by closing her eyes and passing pieces of each through her hands until she could tell them apart by smell alone. She told Sloane, "I'm not going back to the house after every visit, I just go." Sloane said she understood. She was learning to say that without managing what came next. Victor tried once more. He had the patience of a man who had won most of his arguments by outlasting the other party, and he believed this situation would eventually resolve itself in the direction of containment if he waited. He was wrong in a way he had been wrong before without knowing it. He had raised a daughter who had learned his methods well enough to use them against him when the situation required it. She arrived at his office with a folder. The folder contained the corrected estate documents, the amended family records, and a notarized letter acknowledging Dean Marlow's biological paternity. She set it in front of him. He said, "You're letting a carpenter walk into everything we've built," she said. "He's not walking into anything. He's being acknowledged in a document." She paused. "And he doesn't want the money, Dad. He never wanted the money. That should tell you something about what kind of threat he is." Victor did not answer. He was not accustomed to being answered by the thing he had taught. The last scene happened on a Thursday in November. A piece of cherry had arrived Monday. A wide slab, clean-grained, from an estate sale in Eugene, the kind of material Dean bought when it appeared because it would not reappear. It had been sitting across the sawhorses while he decided what it wanted to be. By Wednesday he had decided. a long dining table, for the glass room at the Hastings house, because the table in there was a rectangular production piece with no character, and Piper had mentioned twice in passing that it always felt wrong for the space. On Thursday, Dean, Toby, Ruby, Hazel, and Piper stood around the slab together. Nobody was skilled at all of it equally. Ruby measured twice and then a third time, which was more than necessary, because she was better at analysis than at trusting her own measurements. Hazel took notes in a grid format that was more detailed than any furniture project required. Piper worked slowly and with a care that meant the joints she cut would be the best joints in the piece, even if she took 3 times as long to cut them. Toby corrected everyone continuously, in a tone of voice that was gentle enough that nobody took it as criticism, and said things like, "That's not wrong, it's just going to make sanding harder, which is your call." Dean let them make the mistakes. He watched what each of them noticed and what each of them ignored, and he corrected only when the porn material was at risk. Otherwise, he let them find the process themselves. Sloane appeared in the doorway around 2 in the afternoon. She was wearing a good coat, which was the wrong coat for a workshop, and she knew it, and she did not take it off. She stepped inside. She did not stand in the doorway to assess. She did not move through the space with the particular quality she usually carried in unfamiliar rooms, which was the quality of someone calculating exit routes. She stood inside the door, and she let the smell of the place settle around her, the sawdust and the linseed, and the particular warm note of cherry that Piper had learned to identify with her eyes closed. And she did not try to improve it or redirect it. Dean was at the far end of the slab marking a reference line with a straight edge. He looked up and saw her. He put down the marking tool. He crossed the workshop. He reached into the chest pocket of his work apron and produced a small piece of cherry, palm-sized, no larger than a playing card. He had carved it the previous evening after the others had gone. Into it was set a compass. 4 cardinal points, the North Star in its correct position above the upper arm of the cross. Nothing broken, nothing missing. He held it out. "Who is that for?" Sloane asked. "Sarah," he said. She took it. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Outside, the November rain had started, light, intermittent, drumming on the corrugated roof of the workshop in the irregular way that Portland rain had in autumn. Toby turned on the old radio on the shelf near the door. It found a station after a moment of static. Ruby said the music was going to affect her concentration. Hazel said the humidity in the workshop was going to affect the wood more than the music would affect Ruby. Piper, who had been silent and focused for the better part of an hour, looked up at the exchange between her sisters and laughed. A clear, full laugh, the kind that comes without warning from someone who was not expecting to find anything funny. Dean turned away slightly, just a degree or two. He adjusted the straight edge that did not need adjusting. Toby saw it and said nothing. He understood what his father was doing, giving the feeling room to exist without making it a performance. 20 years was a long time to be excluded from a life that had, in part, come from you. There was no single moment in which 20 years was compensated for or made right. There was no gesture large enough, no document precise enough, no sum of money correct enough to repair what omission at that scale actually costs a person. What there was, instead, was a Thursday in November with rain on the roof and cherry on the sawhorses, and 5 people learning each other's rhythms around a piece of wood that was going to take weeks to finish. Dean had not won anything. He had not fought his way into this room, or argued his way into it, or bought his way into it. He had stood still in the same place, clearly enough and long enough that the truth had been able to find its way back to him. The compass on his forearm was old ink. It would continue to fade. In time it would become something that had to be explained rather than seen, a smudge of blue-gray on the inside of a wrist that had spent 4 decades lifting furniture and sanding edges and holding the particular weight of being a father to a son who had turned out better than the circumstances had any right to produce. But the compass on the piece of cherry in Sloane's hands, in Sarah's hands, was clear. 4 directions, North Star present, nothing broken. Nothing pointing the wrong way. It had taken 20 years to get there. It had taken 3 young women with gray eyes, and a gift for asking the right questions. It had taken 1 honest refusal, and 1 corrected document, and 1 long Thursday with the radio on, and the rain coming down. And it had taken, in the end, only the simplest kind of patience. The kind that keeps a person standing in the same place, doing the same careful work, long enough for the people who need to find them, to finally know where to look.